This afternoon's reading comes from the Gospel according to John, the 8th chapter. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to them, and he sat down and began to teach them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now in the law Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Who could have predicted a decade ago that Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, a man who lived and died over 200 years ago, would in 2018 be a pop culture icon and an essential part of the modern American zeitgeist? You know, other than Lin-Manuel Miranda, who showed up at the White House in 2009 and rapped the opening song from what would eventually become Hamilton, only to be laughed at by Barack and Michelle Obama and later mocked by Jon Stewart. Over the last 3 years, since Hamilton first opened for previews at New York's Public Theater in the fall of 2015, we have seen this musical about the bastard orphan son of a whore and a Scotsman become so ingrained in the public consciousness that it's hard to remember a time when you couldn't walk into a room, yell the word immigrants, and have a group of people yell, "They get the job done," back at you. And yet, as much of a folk hero as the short-tempered protean creator of the Coast Guard and founder of the New York Post has become, it is vital to recall that he was, at his core, a simple, fallible man, a man who in 1791 initiated an extramarital affair with Maria Reynolds, an affair which he would continue for a good year, during which time Reynolds' husband, James, extorted $1,300 from Hamilton. Not a significant amount of money in today's world, but in late 18th century terms, the equivalent of nearly 35,000 of today's dollars. He swept this under the rug somewhat, until the summer of 1797, when journalist James Callender and future President James Monroe uncovered the details of what they thought to be embezzlement from the Federal Reserve, in response to which Hamilton authored a 95-page diatribe entitled, "The Reynolds Pamphlet. Have you read this?" It was likely only a few months before Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem and his subsequent arrest and execution that the woman caught in adultery was brought before him. Having made a fairly low-key trip to the Mount of Olives in the temple, he was busy doing what he usually did when he was there, teaching those who had come to listen. Of course, low-key or not, news of his arrival would have caught the attention of the priests, the Pharisees, and anybody else who seemed to get theological hives anytime Jesus was nearby. His very presence in Jerusalem would have been an affront to a group of men who believed that they and they alone held the keys to the kingdom, and that they and they alone were the proclaimers of God's truth. You know, much like how today Jesus and his teachings are an affront to men who believe that they and they alone hold the keys to the kingdom, and that they and they alone are the proclaimers of God's truth, usually straight white men in big expensive churches that would put Solomon's temple to shame. But I digress. Considering that the Gospels make it clear time and time again that the powers that be were plotting against Jesus, we have to assume that they had a trick or two up their sleeve every time he came within shouting distance, and it seems safe to assume that the adulterous woman of John 8 was one of those tricks. The likelihood that they just happened to come across some random woman committing adultery, well, it strikes me as about as likely as the Cleveland Cavaliers ever again winning a title now that LeBron is gone. So Alexander Hamilton uses the Reynolds Pamphlet to clear his name of charges of corruption, malfeasance, etc. He very clearly explains that he has not committed any crime in league with James Reynolds, who had very much committed a number of crimes, save for
an amorous connection with his wife for a considerable time with his knowing consent.
You know, the part where he more or less took Mariah Reynolds and threw her under the bus in order to clear his own name of criminal activity. Now, this is not to say that Mariah Reynolds was completely innocent. She was an equal participant in the affair with Alexander Hamilton. However, given that she was married to a known criminal, and given the fact that women in the late 18th century did not exactly enjoy the same rights that they have today, it can be safely assumed that her consent, though given, would not have been given with the same enthusiasm with which Hamilton gave his. So we have now a situation where Alexander Hamilton has exercised an unequal power dynamic over Mariah Reynolds, a woman who likely lived in an immensely unequal power dynamic, and has subsequently discarded her like so much trash in order to clear his own name. And that's to say nothing of his collateral damage.
Mrs. Hamilton, with our children being absent on a visit to her father. No.
The woman that was brought before Jesus, who was she? Where did she come from? How did this happen? Was she the wife of one of the very men in power who brought her to Jesus? For that matter, what of the man with whom she was caught en flagrante? First of all, where was he? The Mosaic law stated that both parties were to suffer the consequences for their actions. Whether or not he was married, he was complicit in adultery, meaning that he was to be punished. And yet the man was nowhere to be found. Secondly, who was he? For all we know, he too was in on the act, one of the Pharisees or an associate who agreed to sleep with this married woman, such a burden for him, I'm sure, in order to get Jesus' attention and subsequently bring him down. And the thing is, why? Why did they want to bring Jesus down? He was not a real threat to them. He had precisely zero interest in starting a new religion. He just wanted to show the Jewish people a better way to live within their own religion, a religion that had had priests and leaders and teachers for millennia. Their positions were quite secure. You know, maybe it's because he had made clear that he wasn't there for them. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, Jesus had told them, but the sick. These people already knew what they needed to know. Jesus wasn't there for them. He was there for everybody else. And sometimes when people in power realize somebody popular doesn't care about them, well, sometimes those people in power have themselves a little tantrum.
I'm not here for you.
When news of Alexander Hamilton's indiscretions reached the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, where his sister-in-law Angelica Schuyler Church resided in London, she made tracks for New York. In the context of the musical, there's a barely unspoken question of unrequited romantic attraction between Alexander and Angelica. In real life, what we know is that they regarded each other as intellectual equals and confided in one another at length. In any event, her arrival in New York was not for the purpose of showing her affection and support for Hamilton, but rather for the woman on whom he had cheated. And throughout the duration of the song, the Reynolds Pamphlet, and the following Burn, it's made quite clear that of the women in Hamilton's life, at least two of them, his wife, Eliza Schuyler Hamilton, and Angelica, are absolutely done with him. He's treated them in no better a fashion than he treated Mariah Reynolds, and they're no longer there for him. And in real life, Hamilton did indeed throw a tantrum, going to James Monroe, who, as you may remember, was one of those who was investigating Hamilton's alleged misdeeds, and challenging him to a duel. Ironically, he would be talked out of this duel by the man who would eventually kill him in such a confrontation, Senator Aaron Burr. Realistically, though, that was the end of Hamilton's political influence for several years.
Man's gonna be president now. That's gonna be president now. One less thing to worry about. That's one less thing to worry about.
On the other side of the spectrum of patience and tolerance, though, stood Jesus, or more accurately, he knelt there. Not one to be drawn into confrontation or lose his temper as Alexander Hamilton would be some 8 centuries later. Jesus seemed to make a decision that if the priests and Pharisees were going to make this confrontation about them, he would be only too happy to oblige. We don't know what Jesus wrote in the dirt that day when he knelt down, but whatever it was sufficiently disquieting as to cause the Pharisees and priests to walk away one by one, leaving behind their accusations, their condemnations, and their insidious plotting, at least until another day. One by one, they walked away until there were none left. "Woman," Jesus said, "where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," was her reply.
The Reynolds Pamphlet. Have you read this?
When James Reynolds undertook whatever actions he committed to cause Moriah to flee to Alexander, seeking his assistance, he treated her with no more regard than the Pharisees treated the woman who they likely entrapped in adultery. When Alexander Hamilton chose to have an affair with Moriah, he not only degraded her, but his wife as well. He became the villain in his own story, the one about whom Jesus wrote in the dirt. Now, my wife, Katie, is the director of a domestic violence shelter. Every day she works with women who have fled their own personal James Reynoldses, who have been thrown at the feet of the authorities by their own personal Pharisees. And none of these women are perfect. Most, if not all of them, have, in some measure, contributed to their lives being a mess. But they are still human beings, to be treated with respect and regard. Much like Moriah Reynolds and the woman in John 8, we must look at these women and say, this is a whole person, created in the image of God. What has been done is not our concern. Rather, our concern is the manner in which we treat this person. In our culture, despite shifts in the last few years and decades, despite a robust feminist movement to break women free of their cultural shackles, we still heavily objectify women and still very much treat them as objects to be owned, not people to be respected. And as long as we allow that to continue, there will still be women accused by Pharisees. There will still be Moriah Reynoldses mistreated by James Reynolds and Alexander Hamilton alike. And it is our responsibility to stand between these women and those who would accuse them and abuse them. For too long, they have been treated as less than human, and it is our responsibility to change that. When the accusers come forth with their stones, ask them who among them has not sinned. And remembering that you yourself are not entitled to throw stones, stand empty-handed as you invite them to cast the first stone. And when they inevitably yield and walk away, turn to the woman who has been accused. Where are they? You must ask her. Has no one condemned you? No one. Then neither do I condemn you. We shall not condemn, but uplift. We shall not accuse, but enrich. We shall not betray, but love. And so, to each of us, hear now the last words of Christ from this passage. Go your way, and from now on, do not sin again. Amen.